Alright, in this video I want to talk about what atypical depression is and what melancholic depression is. So it's called atypical depression more because of historical reasons. So atypical doesn't mean uncommon or unusual, it's more to distinguish it from melancholic depression. So melancholic depression is also called endogenous depression, and it refers to severe biologically mediated illness. So it was thought to be the prototypical form of depression, and it manifested with neurovegetative symptoms and a non-reactive mood. In the DSM-5, the atypical versus melancholic, they're not their own diagnoses, but specifiers of the MDD diagnosis. So the criteria for melancholic features, so 1 is loss of pleasure, so it's focused on the anhedonia, and 2 is lack of reactivity, so it's referring to the lack of mood reactivity. And the lack of mood reactivity is referring to the fact that if something good happens, this person's mood doesn't cheer up. So if like a puppy walks in the room or the person's child comes and says, hey, I got a promotion, this person's still going to look really dysphoric. And then 3 or more of the following symptoms: complete despondency, depression worse in the morning, early morning awakenings, marked psychomotor agitation or retardation, significant anorexia, and excessive guilt. And then quickly looking at the DSM atypical features, the main criteria is mood reactivity. So the person brightens up to that puppy walking into the room. Then 2 or more of the following: significant weight gain, hypersomnia, leaden paralysis, and a long-standing pattern of interpersonal rejection sensitivity. And this cluster of symptoms is why it's called reversed neurovegetative symptoms. So how did this distinction come to be? So melancholic was like the OG depression, also called endogenous, also called biological, also called severe. And what doctors noticed was that it regularly responded to the TCA imipramine and ECT. But they found that there was a subtype of depressive patients who didn't respond to these treatments. Rather, they responded to iproniazid, the MAOI. They found that these patients had an unusual constellation of symptoms. Notably, they had an absence of the endogenous neurovegetative symptoms, and they had the presence of emotional reactivity. So historically, these patients responded to MAOIs and not the TCAs and the ECT. And looking at some of the biological correlates can help us understand some of the differences. So we see major differences in the HPA axis activity. So by HPA, I mean the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So studies in melancholic depression have found HPA axis hyperactivity. So with that overactive HPA axis, what we get is hypercortisolism. And this helps to make sense of a lot of the vegetative symptoms. So high levels of cortisol can explain the weight loss and the disturbed sleep. This is in comparison to the atypical depression, where we see a relatively hypoactive stress response. And we see a relatively low cortisol in atypical depression compared to melancholic depression. Another interesting difference is that patients with atypical depression show abnormally large right hemisphere bias in SPECT scans. How do I make sense of this? So the right parietal lobe is associated with picking up emotions. So it makes sense that there's interpersonal rejection sensitivity because they have a hyperactive right hemisphere. So that overactivity could be a hyperattunement and overreactivity to negative emotions from other people. And some people consider the interpersonal rejection sensitivity to be one of the core symptoms of atypical depression. So this rejection sensitivity is typically a lifelong trait that's exacerbated during depressive episodes. And this excessive sensitivity to rejection and criticism leads to functional impairment. And I can't help but wonder if this is why phenelzine has been shown to be especially effective in social anxiety disorder. So phenelzine has an unrivaled effect size that's double that of the other medications. So maybe somehow MAOIs are improving the rejection sensitivity and making social anxiety reduced. And then just a few random facts. So although it's termed atypical, it's actually a common form of depression and one of the most common forms in outpatient settings. Probably about 15 to 36% of patients with depression have atypical features. In the STAR-D trials, it was 18%, and it's probably even higher in bipolar II and dysthymia. Typically, atypical patients have an earlier onset of symptoms and a more chronic course than melancholic depression. We see it more common in younger women, and we see more comorbid conditions with atypical. And another important feature to know is that melancholic depressive patients typically feel worse in the morning, compared to atypical depression, which typically feels worse in the evening. And there's 2 things that help me remember this. So first, we know that melancholic depression is really linked to the high cortisol. And of course, cortisol is highest in the morning. So it's not surprising that melancholic depression is worse in the morning. And then I think of the rejection sensitivity with the atypical depression. So as the day goes on, they have to deal with more and more interpersonal stress. So it makes sense that as the day goes on, they get worse and worse. I have no clue if that's actually what's going on, but it helps me remember it. And then to summarize, the characteristic biological profile of atypical depression is normal or abnormally decreased HPA axis, a relatively normal polysomnogram, and abnormally increased right hemispheric processing in psychophysiological tasks. And historically, it's treated better with MAOIs than TCAs. Hello, I am the creator of Psychofarm. I'm here today to announce the Psychofarm Antidepressant Psychopharmacology course. I've put what can only be described as a stupid amount of time into making this course. I learned a new software so that the graphics are nice and clean. I've put all my free time into making these videos. I'm covering a lot in this course. It's going to go over kind of the basics of treating depression. It's going to go over the SSRIs, the SNRIs, the MAOIs, the TCAs, and some of the atypical antidepressants. I really appreciate all the support. If you can share this with people who you think would be interested in this course, I would really appreciate it. If this goes okay, then I can justify continuing to spend so much time on making this stuff, and I hope to eventually move to an antipsychotic course, a mood stabilizer course. I have a lot of ideas, I just need to justify using all this time on these projects. Thank you for watching, thank you for considering. Have a good day.